What would you do in a severe upset? And frankly, there's not a lot of choices. Time's just not on your side. And I think that's what happened to the Cirrus SR22 in Knoxville. They experienced just that situation. So stick with us on Flywire. Hi, I'm Scott Perdue, and today on Flywire, we're going to look into the accident of the SR22 162 Alpha Mike at Knoxville, Tennessee on December 16th, 2021. In a little bit, I'm going to show you the flight path and some telltale data that points directly at a wake vortex upset that ended badly. It looks like the pilot of the SR22 was demonstrating a new product on his airplane, and one I was actually looking forward to seeing, and he had done at least one previous approach on this flight. On the accident leg, he was advised of airliner traffic that was in front of him and first to land on the runway in front of him. The airliner was an Airbus A320, and while it is not officially considered a heavy aircraft, it outweighs an SR22 by a lot. ATC ensures that a 5-mile buffer exists between heavy aircraft over 300,000 pounds and everyone else because of some hard lessons were learned that led to that separation rule. In this accident, the spacing was less than 2 miles, about 1.8. In fact, the Airbus A320 is 50 times heavier than the SR22. To use a car comparison, an 18-wheel tractor-trailer outweighs a VW Bug by about 27 times, and it'll squash it flat in a heartbeat. So first, let's talk a little bit about wake vortex. What is it anyway? Well, this is a shot that someone took of a 757 on approach, and you can clearly see the tight circles of air spilling off the flaps of the airliner. You can also see the mature vortex of a previous airplane, the swirl, that had passed along that course just previously. All airplanes spill off a wake vortex from the wingtips. It's a function of the low-pressure air on top of the wing combining with the high-pressure air on the bottom of the wing, and it twists as it meets and spins up. That's what a vortex is. And here's a vortex test using a crop duster and colored smoke to highlight the vortex so we can see it better. Winglets that are used in commonly on airliners these days damp the vortex somewhat, but not completely. And typically the worst condition is heavy, slow, and clean. Next to that, frankly, is low, slow, and configured for landing. If you're following behind a larger airplane, it's best to stay above their flight path all the way to the ground. Don't go below them. But it is important to note that a wake vortex upset can happen at any altitude, okay, at really any speed. In cruise flight, for one, here's a video of a test done with a 737 flying behind a 727 at approximately 190 knots. He's about 1,000 feet below. This is a typical speed profile that was flown by both of these airplanes in the 90s. It's a little bit different for nowadays, but let's watch the video and see the rolling moment induced when the 737 flies through the wake vortex of the 727 in front. Realize that the pilot of this airplane was attempting to prevent the roll from happening, but they were just along for the ride. The reason why this test was done was a U.S. Air 737 crashed on September 8, 1994 during descent into Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The 737 was being vectored behind a Delta 727, also headed to Pittsburgh. The 73 flew into the unseen wake of the preceding 727 and began yaw and roll to the left, almost exactly like what we see in that video. The 727 wake vortex was very localized, and it was not responsible for the subsequent loss of control that led to the crash of the 73. In all likelihood, the flight crew mishandled the rudder, and that exacerbated the yaw and rolling tendency. Recovery was further compromised when the pilots exerted extreme aft stick pressure at the same time as rudder and aileron inputs. They had full right. We can watch the video on that. The investigation produced a look at the flight control deflection, so let's check it out. To paraphrase the reaction of the flight crew to the upset caused by the flying into the wake vortex of the preceding 727, they put the 7.3 into a snap roll. A snap roll is performed by abrupt movement of the elevators aft in conjunction with rudder fully one way. These guys also had right aileron. You do not need to be near stall speed to make an airplane snap roll. The controls in this accident were mishandled all the way to the ground, and that's a sad thing that happened. We can learn a couple of things from this accident. namely that a wake vortex upset can happen to virtually any airplane at virtually any altitude. I personally have had experienced such an upset in my airline career, and I can attest the fact that you fly through the wake fairly quickly, and then you unload it, and then you recover from the upset and the attitude. Which brings me to the second takeaway, and that is pilot performance. If you've never experienced this kind of upset before, if you haven't trained for this, then the likelihood of successfully recovering from the situation is, shall we say, not enhanced by you making it up as you go along. It isn't just going to happen. Perhaps a well-trained and experienced aerobatic pilot can see what's happening, quickly decide on the correct action, and do it without breaking the airplane. But the odds of you doing it, making it up as you go along, not good. Incorrect pilot action will turn a momentary awkward situation into a disaster in seconds. Look up the American 587. It's an Airbus 300 that flew into the wake of a heavy 747 with disastrous consequences. Primarily, it was due to the pilot flying. As the pilot flying, he totally misunderstood and misused the use of the rudder, and the tail ended with the tail coming off. It's nearly impossible to predict when an upset will happen to you, and frankly, a speed like DMMS or a ballistic recovery system is not going to save you when this kind of stuff hits the fan. So let's get back to the incident at Knoxville. Comparing the flight paths of the two airplanes is probably the best way to see how this worked, or see what happened. The Airbus A320 was at about 1,300 feet above the ground at 130 knots at point X. You can see that on that picture. It crossed this point on the sky at 14:53:07. And I'll bet you it was fully configured for landing, was on the ILS. Its descent rate was 704 feet per minute, and in the airlines, you always use an instrument approach as a backup, even if you're doing a visual approach. These guys were not making it up as they go along. Now let's look at the SR22. At 14:54:12, it crossed point X at 1,100 feet. The descent rate of a wake vortex is about 300 to 500 feet per minute in relatively calm air. This puts the Cirrus pretty dang close to where the wake vortex would be from the A320 that had passed over that spot just over a minute ago. The last ADS-B hit shows the airplane following a curved, erratic flight path about 38 seconds later. And then, more importantly, look at the descent rate at this last hit. It is clocking in at 5,500 feet per minute down. That's out of control. The unfortunate pilot in this accident lived long enough to relate what happened to the first responders, and his passengers survived, and now it's fantastic. He said that he hit wake turbulence, the airplane lost lift, rolled inverted, and he activated the ballistic parachute. The airplane then impacted the ground. His speed on the base turn was about 90 knots, which was a decent speed for that point in the approach. He saw the traffic ahead of him. His only concern was the potential of a collision, and he wasn't thinking about wake vortex, wake turbulence. He ran into it. When the intensity of the wake vortex will kick a similar-sized airplane into 20 to 30 degrees of roll, it's going to flip a light plane inverted in a heartbeat. The SR22 did not lose lift. It yawed and rolled inverted in that high-intensity vortex. Before you get the opinion that I'm unfairly hitting on Cirrus drivers, I believe the parachute is a good thing. It is a great safety device when used properly, but it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. You still have to do that pilot stuff, and at 750 feet above the ground, inverted, the chute is just not going to work in time to save you. There isn't enough time or altitude to survive that. It just isn't. So in this case, the pilot stuff required is not intuitive. That's why I'm stressing this. For most of our flying, you use aft stick or up elevator to stay away from the ground. Hopefully you have enough speed to do that. Don't stall. At least that's the oversimplified version. In the case of this Cirrus and the US Air 737, aft stick was absolutely the wrong thing to do. In fact, the situation required an aggressive push on the yoke, a serious unloading of the wing. You have to stop the nose track down towards the ground. You don't have a lot of time to do it. And I guess to be crude, you have the rest of your life to do that, but pulling aft on the yoke is going to shorten that time frame. In my opinion, the biggest takeaway from these accidents is that you will always have to fly the airplane. Nothing prepares you for that better than training. the probability of finding yourself inverted close to the ground is low. I'm going to admit that. It doesn't happen very often, but it does. It's certainly not a zero probability. So I urge you to get your head in the game, go out and get training in UPRT, maybe even do recurrent every year or so. Practice flying the airplane outside of your $100 hamburger profile, because you never know when you're going to need those skills like right now. So just to foot stomp it, you stay above the flight path of the preceding airplane. I don't care if he's your size. Don't follow right behind him or below him. I've even hit wake turbulence in my Stearman following another Stearman, and it tries to flip it over too. So if you like the video, hit like and subscribe. It looks a bit like this here. And I'd like to thank my brain trust here as well. If you guys like to support the channel, I'll leave a link below to the Flywire Patreon page. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Flywire.